a blog called The Knitted, which you should definitely check out. I'll include the link down here, as well as my Ravelry username and my Instagram name. That way you can find me on all those different locations. But today I want to talk to you about how to avoid ladders being formed when you're knitting in the round. So when you're knitting in the round, when you switch from one needle to the other, at that point when you change, those stitches can be a little bit loose and your tension may not stay the same as you go around that curve, and that's what causes ladders. So this happens to everyone. It was a huge struggle recently for me when I was knitting this sweater. On the sleeve, I had a ladder that went all the way down, and I kept knitting in denial, thinking that this will block out, even though the ladder was about the size of my pinky. It didn't block out. I did a lot of research about how to avoid ladders being formed, and since then, I've knit two nice looking sleeves. So today I'm going to talk about using double pointed needles as well as the two circular needle technique, because those are two of my favorites. So keep on watching for that. So let's start with double pointed needles. Now double pointed needles have the potential to trip you up the most because you're either working with 3 different needles or 4 different needles, just depending on what you're doing, which means that there are 3 different areas where you are transitioning between needles where you can have problems and get some ladders. But avoiding those ladders is pretty easy to do. So what you do, you knit your first stitch just like you normally would. Then when you're tensioning it, you want to bring your working needle down so it's about parallel to the needle with the stitches on it. And what that does, when you tighten it, on the back side you can see that the stitch that you just created right here is about even and all buddied up to the stitch on the needle. So that distance there is about the same distance as between the stitches on the needle. So they're close, and you don't get that extra space in between there. So make sure he's still all nice and tight. Knit your second stitch, again making sure that your needle that you're working with is about parallel to where the needle with the stitches are. Knit a third stitch, and then after about the third stitch you can just continue to knit along like normal. So let's get to the other side. That way I can show that to you again really fast. All right, so now we're at another needle transition point where a ladder could form. Again, you want to knit your first stitch like you normally would. As you're tensioning, pull it down tight so that your working needle is close to your needle with the stitches on it. Knit your second stitch and then continue. And I've found, just as an aside, that having the needle that your working needle underneath this needle makes it a lot easier as opposed to having it, trying to alter it like this up here. I find that that creates more space, and so you have a higher chance of having a ladder being formed. And so that's it. That's how you avoid getting ladders in your work when working with double pointed needles. Okay, so now let's talk about how to avoid ladders when you are doing the 2 circular needle method. So you have 1 circular needle dedicated for the front stitches, and the second circular needle dedicated for these back stitches. So with this method, there are only 2 places where a ladder can form at each of the joins when you're transitioning from needle to needle. So when you are doing this method, you want to use needles that have cables that are pretty flexible. the more rigid the needles are, the harder it's going to be to knit seamlessly without a transition or without a ladder right here. So let's get started. When you're transitioning between needles, the first thing that you want to do is take the back needle and bring that cable up and underneath where you're working, where your needle is now, your front needle like this. And you can just hold that in place with your thumb. And what this does is it brings the stitches that you just worked up really close to the stitch that you are about to work. So knit your first stitch like you normally would. And then when you're pulling it down, you can see that the distance between the stitch that you just worked and the last stitch on the row that you had worked previously are really close to each other. So you don't want to pull super tight with this, but you also don't want to keep your stitch loose. You just want to make sure that it is about even. And I found that if you keep your working needle about parallel to where that cable is and those stitches are, then that works just fine. Then you knit your second stitch. Again, make sure that it's about even. Third stitch, and by your third stitch, you can let go of the cable and just continue knitting on nicely. And so what that does is it reduces the distance between the stitch that you are going to work, that first stitch on the row, and the last stitch on the back row. And that makes it easier to make sure that there is enough yarn so that you don't get ladders. So let me show this to you one more time. So you flip your work, and now we are going between our back needle that we were just using to our front needle. Get it all set up properly. These needles are a little bit long and floppy. All right. So again, what you do is you bring the cable from the needle that you had just used, your back needle, and bring it up and lined up underneath the needle that you are working with. And you can hold that in place with your thumb. And again, the stitches that you are about to work, or that you had just worked, are now lined up pretty nicely. You knit your first stitch just like you normally would. And then when you're pulling down and tensioning, you bring it so it is all buddied up with that stitch on the back row. Knit your second stitch, and then by your third stitch, you can let go of this cable and then just knit across. And that's it. That's how you avoid ladders when you are doing the 2 circular needle method. Having ladders in your knitting, one of the easiest ways to do that is to have the first stitch on your row be a knit stitch. But sometimes having the first stitch be a purl stitch is unavoidable because that's, what your pattern calls for. But luckily you can still avoid having a nasty cable there or a nasty ladder there by doing this one little technique. So again, I am using the 2 circular needle technique. And so the first stitch on this row is a purl stitch right there. So if I were to purl into the stitch just like I normally would, where I go over and then under and then tension it, I can't really get very close to this first stitch or this last stitch on the back row. Even if I were to bring the cable up, I still have a huge distance between this first stitch and this back stitch. And that's because when I'm making this stitch, it has a long distance that it has to go. You have to go all the way over top and all the way underneath. And so this creates a large distance and a lot of yardage, so you can't get it really close. But you can knit your purl stitch in a slightly different way to reduce that. And what you do is you go underneath and then back over. And this uses a lot less yarn. And when you knit that stitch, you're able to get it a lot closer to that last stitch on your back row. See how close and buddied up they are? And that's what avoids having cables be formed. Essentially what you're doing is you are creating a twisted stitch for this first stitch. You can also use this same technique when you're doing cables. So on the row, when you cable, that first purl stitch can sometimes be really sloppy and messy. And if you use this method, you avoid that and you have a nice clean edge. So let me create my cable really fast. That way I can show you how it's done. All right, so now we're at the first purl stitch right after we had done our cables. So what you do is you go underneath and over like that, and then that'll let you pull this purl stitch really close to that stitch that you had just worked. And then you can keep on knitting. So for the cables, you only need to do this twisted purl stitch on the row when you are forming the cables. So you only have to do this once whenever you form the cables. To avoid ladders, when you start a row with a purl, you should do it every single time. And that's it. That's how you avoid ladders being formed when you're doing the purls.